She returned to FCNL in 2011 and led our Middle East policy until April of this year, when she left FCNL to take the position as the Congressional Progressive Caucus Foreign Policy Fellow in Congressman Ro Khanna's office. In her work at FCNL, Kate was not only instrumental in lobbying for and securing Senate support for the Iran nuclear deal, she was named a top lobbyist of 2018 by the publication The Hill. Kate built on FCNL's longtime advocacy for preventing war and creating peace as her reputation as a relentless and knowledgeable lobbyist has grown. Well, she's not really lobbying right now, but she sort of is, right? Okay, Gould. Next to Kate is Madeline Rose. Madeline came to work at FCNL in 2014 as a legislative assistant for the peaceful prevention of deadly conflict, during a time when conflict in the Central African Republic surged. Madeline's leadership made a mark in Washington, both with members of Congress and at the White House, that issued a very special directive based on Madeline's substantive, persistent raising this issue with people in the administration. Madeline's life is dedicated to peace and justice. From her time working at the United Nations prior to being a staffer on the Hill, to the 5 years she spent at Mercy Corps in policy development after leaving FCNL, to her current role leading the Plus Peace Coalition. She's a director of coalition campaigns and policy with a number of leading international peacebuilding organizations, including our colleague AFSC. Madeline has been a lead lobbyist for the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act, which passed the House late last year and is awaiting action in the Senate. Wardah Khalid joined FCNL as a Scoville Fellow in 2015, working alongside Kate Gould and the Foreign Policy team for 9 months. The Scoville Fellowship is a highly competitive program in peace and national security. Candidates who are selected for the fellowship get to choose which peace and security organization they want to work with. I was actually on the Scoville board when Wardah was interviewed and remember thinking, I want her. Originally from Houston, Wardah's life before Washington, D.C. included working in accounting and I think hosting a television show. Radio show, okay. Since leaving FCNL, Wardah has worked as media relations manager at Church World Service Immigration and Refugee Program, and she founded the Poligon Education Fund, an advocacy organization dedicated to strengthening Muslim American engagement with Congress. Wardah was recognized by ABC's Nightline as one of the country's top millennial activists. Currently, she works on the Hill in Congressman Judy Chu's office as a fellow through the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Please join me in welcoming our panel this evening. So we did prep the panel a little bit beforehand to prime a question that I'm going to ask each of them to respond to for about 3 minutes. But please begin thinking about what questions you might have, because we do want to turn to the audience within about 20 minutes and get your questions. So given Diana's framing that changing the militarist paradigm will require a radical revolution of values, how do you envision these changes must happen? What would be your, quote, long-term roadmap for a change, to change a plan to counteract the economic, political, and ideological sources of militarism in 3 big sectors? All right, this is a mammoth question, I guess. So specifically, we asked Madeline to talk a little bit about mass movements and what's going to have to happen, for Wardah to talk a little bit about media, and for Kate to talk about Congress and policy leaders. Now, I know all 3 of you know something about each of those, so Madeline, do you want to start?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, is it on? Can folks hear me?
Yep.
No. Really close. Take it off. Closer? Better? There we go.
Yep.
Okay, nice. Oh, wow. Not on a microphone very often. Well, thank you so much to FCNL for having me. I remember when I first moved to Washington and I was told that
FCNL, basically, if you ever made a good advocate on peace, they've at some point worked for FCNL. Basically across the city, and I think that shows tonight. And yeah, it's just so great to be back. And also, I think FCNL staff has doubled since I was here, so congratulations and amazing work. So, in terms of mass movements, so who in the room has heard of the Green New Deal? So, what we've been doing a lot of thinking about this year at the Plus Peace Coalition and the Alliance for Peacebuilding, which is a new, Plus Peace is essentially a new movement mobilization wing of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. A lot of my year has been spent asking our members, what's the Green New Deal for peace? What is the prophetic vision that will get us above all of the small, piecemeal, individual ideas that we all have and will unite us around this collective agenda? And I think to Diana's comments about, FCNL has played a critical role in helping normalize the notion that war is not the answer. What we haven't done was then, well then what is, right? And I think the Green New Deal provides a really good template for us on the peace and peacebuilding side to think about how we do that and why. So the Green New Deal itself, as again many of you probably know, actually came into the fore of the public debate in the early 2000s. It was an idea from the Lithuanian Green Party introduced in climate debates, I think in 2003, 2005, 2008. But the idea, it took birth, it didn't quite get its legs, and here we are, and finally, it's a primary organizing idea that has galvanized the whole climate change community towards a more prophetic vision of the future. And how did that happen, right? What happened was, it was introduced as an idea once, didn't gain traction. It was discussed among diplomats in the UN for years and years and years, didn't gain traction. It was raised in certain political debates all around the world. But finally what happened was deliberate and intentional organizing behind the scenes of united, climate experts, so existing movements, climate funders who invested in a youth-led organizing model around organizing communities, not just experts, but organizing people most affected by most affected by climate change, organizing folks on the front lines, right? They're using that term front lines, right? Who's the front lines of the climate movement, and deliberately organizing them so that they created an unbeatable kind of political, policy, and movement infrastructure, right? That Wellstone triangle of all the three things that you need for structural change. So when I think of how do we attack this deeply rooted sense of militarism that has now bled into our culture and our policies, and is so intertwined into 10 million different war power rules that you couldn't even try to unwind via legislation if you tried, as Dan articulated, I really think it's the organizing that has to be done on the back end around a prophetic big idea that we, everyone in this room, and all the peace builders around the world have to figure out how we organize ourselves around. And one criticism or one piece of pushback I get from my members every day is, well, we're so diverse, peace means so many things, so many different people. And my response is always, look, it's not like climate change isn't diverse, right? I started my career in climate change. You did greenhouse gas, accounting, and you do carbon credits, and you do natural resource management, and you do forestation and deforestation. There's literally millions and millions of nonprofits all around the world who work on climate change. But they were able to be united in an iterative and long-term process, in part through the Paris Agreement. But now, even beyond that, even with countries like our own pulling out of the Paris Agreement, you have these mechanisms rooted in a deep organizing structure that is, I believe, going to save the planet from climate catastrophe. And so, I think that is for me, a guiding star of how we can organize around a prophetic idea and a true commitment to a new form of organizing, to Diana's other point about diversity, which I'll always talk about in a bit as well. But that would be my initial response.
Thank you, Alan. That's terrific.
Can you all hear me? All right, awesome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to FCNL for inviting me. It is such a pleasure to be back here. FCNL is where I started learning how to lobby, so it's really exciting to come back and talk about progressions in the movement. As far as media goes, I think it's really simple, especially when it comes, you asked for the economic side and the militarization side, to just show what's happening. If you just think about what's been in the news for the last couple of months, we've seen protests and movements everywhere from Egypt to Hong Kong to Gaza, Lebanon. And the reason why we can see that is because of social media, which has really changed the game. And I think the more that we see that, the more people are realizing that our current system is not okay. The way that we are approaching world problems is not okay. We can actually see the damage that our policies are doing on the ground, or what other autocratic governments are doing on the ground. How do we fix that? So I think identifying the problem is really, really important, and I think media helps a lot of that. Today on the Hill, there was a Hill briefing on Kashmir, and for those of you, I'm sure you've heard, there's been, there's always been this tension between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and about 100 days ago, India revoked Article 370 and immediately did a communications blackout. No internet, no phone, no cell phone, no cable TV. Can you imagine how that would be if you went through something like that? And the reason why they did that is so people could not witness the human rights abuses that were taking place there. So I think that's why it's so important for us to support journalists. Foreign journalists were not allowed to go in Kashmir. Members of Congress were not allowed to go in Kashmir. It's important to support the journalists, support what they're working on. They put themselves in incredible danger to bring us these stories so that we can see for ourselves and make our own decisions. First, taking what people are telling us is happening, the reasoning behind it. Now we can actually go and make our own decisions with the media. And so I think that's really important for us to just kind of use that and use our own networks. I know, for instance, Veterans Day just happened, and that is a contentious holiday, I'm sure, for some people, because maybe you're celebrating militarization. I found a story on my Twitter on Veterans Day of a Muslim Marine who was writing that, usually on Veterans Day people say, thank you for your service. And he said, if your idea of the military does not include me as a brown-skinned person or somebody who practices Islam, then don't thank me for my service, because it's either all of us or none of us. And I shared that on my Facebook because I actually happen to be now in the Truman National Security Project, which I think Kate did as well, which involves a lot of veterans, many of them who are working for peace and security now after their service, and they're some of our greatest advocates. And they shared it and they viewed that story and put it along their networks. And I remember somebody in my network pushed back. She was Muslim, and she was like, I don't need to send out these articles celebrating imperialism and human rights abuses and things like that just to combat Islamophobia. And I was like, I hear you. I can see why you think that. And I'm not denying that there's human rights abuses happening or this militarism is causing problems. However, there are people that certain things speak to. Different things appeal to different people. And for the veterans in my network, or people who know veterans, or who do respect the military and the idea of what it could do for good, that story really made them think like, oh yeah, there are people that look like that in the media, and are in the military, and there is the side to think about that when we're saying thank you for your service, that is inclusive of everyone. So I think just putting those stories and narratives out there is what the media is really good for, and just changing our way of the way we traditionally maybe have been thinking about things in the past.
Okay.
Good evening, friends. So great to be back with you all. I missed you so much. And such an honor to be on this superstar panel. Just women who I admire so deeply and have learned so much from, all of them. So thanks for having me back. When I first came to FCNL as a program assistant, I had, even though my earliest memories were political, but I had never had this concept or this idea of trying to change the world by sitting down and talking with members of Congress and their staff, and that that's something that everybody can do, and that it's not just the territory of K Street lobbyists. And certainly I think as far as a roadmap for Congress to get to the kind of vision that Diana is talking about, there's just nothing more important than that. Nothing, more important than what you're doing. And it's so inspiring what you've been doing this weekend. And it's particularly inspiring, I think, this year, where we've seen the National Defense Authorization Act, this vehicle that has passed for 58 years in a row. Every year it passes, it authorizes the Pentagon, even when other government agencies don't get that kind of treatment, don't get passed over and haven't been authorized for years and years and years and years. But it's been used as the vehicle traditionally it's been used for giant giveaways for Pentagon, for defense contractors. That's a lot of the momentum to get this through every year. It's really, just quite the beast. Of course, as you all know from working on this and trying to get the 2002 repeal in it, I had the experience this year of getting to work for a member of Congress on the Armed Services Committee, and so getting to be there through the markup that the committee has of the National Defense Authorization Act, and it went for 21 hours. I went home at 3:30, but it went until about 7. I think that's when people all went home when it ended, and it was the first time that I had seen, like 2 in the morning. I saw people, I saw, all through the night, just defense contractors, all through the morning, afternoon, and night, defense contractors, walking in and out. There were, of course, when members of Congress or staff would step out, then often they would be talking to, the defense contractors would be lobbying them, they would have their lobbyists there, and so much of the bill is about putting that, that pork in, putting those goodies for the Pentagon, for defense contractors into the bill. And it's been so incredible to get to see that bill, that vehicle for these giant giveaways for, this slush fund for the Pentagon, all that, for it to actually be used as a vehicle for advancing peace, for advancing the kind of vision that we want. And we got to do a whole lot more of that. It's been, so that's been the vehicle for getting this amendment on preventing unauthorized war in Iran, for repealing the 2002 AUMF, for cutting off military support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, for stopping arms sales to the Saudis. It's been, we figured out a way to co-opt it for peace purposes, and it's been a year where it's also been a year, of course, where the progressive votes have really mattered on this, where progressive members of Congress who hadn't voted for the NDAA in the past were, for the first time, thinking, okay, wait, here's a real decision. Do I vote for it or not? I do not support, a lot of these members, do not support these outrageous levels of defense spending, but it's also the opportunity to get, to get these policy provisions through, and so I think there's a way to look at that, this whole enterprise and this whole process, and in a way where we are actually something that Diane taught me about. I remember when. I don't know if you remember when he said that FCNL compromises on politics, not principle. And I just think of that often about this challenge for us as friends, like how do we confront this mammoth beast that is used for purposes that friends aren't going to support, but also use it to think about how we reshape the way that the U.S. engages with the world. And that's going to be a really important discussion. It is right now, and it's going to continue to be. It's going to be this opportunity to lift up these kinds of issues that we want to talk about in envisioning a new way that the U.S. can engage with the rest of the world.
Thank you. Let me ask one more question, and I wanted to offer you guys. each other a question if you have one. But I want to go to the point, Diana raised a point about the influence of money, obviously. And Kate, you just talked about that in terms of the influence of money in even the negotiations around the NDAA. Madeline, you spoke about, really organizing, which costs some money, but not like in the same way. So the sort of, and Wardah, your comment about media, in some ways, if you think about social media, it is an equalizer. You don't necessarily have to have money, but you might need to be better organized. So I guess I'm just interested in like whether this issue, I know that's a very broad question, but how important is it to, we think about like what to tackle in this, leviathan of trying to change the militarist paradigm. How important is it to expose or respond to corporate interests or to moneyed interests with regard to whether it's media, mass movements, or Congress?
I can take that as a former corporate person. So the important thing to remember about corporations is they are responsible to their shareholders, right? So they are responsible for making them money. That money doesn't necessarily have to be made in a bad way. So when we think about these big corporations that have corporate social responsibility movements, they have offices, there's people, dedicated staff that are thinking about how can these corporations do good. I think that's because the people want them to do good. They don't want these corporations simply to be making a profit and putting that in their pockets. So I think appealing to that side can help with corporations somewhat, but at the end of the day, it's gonna come down to people, right? So we have a lot of different people, they will boycott certain products because a corporation was using their tools for some negative purpose, or they will write them letters or do social media campaigns because they disagree with their principles. Like there's still ways to integrate mass movements and media and Congress in dealing with corporations. You just have to start thinking about it a little differently and think about what is the most strategic way that you can have shareholders agree with this and respond to this and demand this of the corporation themselves.
So I think that Kate's example that she just gave about defense contractors staying up for 21 hours just to hang out in the committee room of the NDA markup is pretty illustrative of the very real economic considerations we need to think about in our advocacy. I was just out in New Mexico. So I moved to, I live in California, I live in the Bay Area, which is really driven by money these days. But in California and in New Mexico, there's kind of this emerging peace dialogue framed in the framework of creating a peace industrial complex. It's a good crowd. I don't always get that reaction. Sometimes the action is like eye rolling and capitalism is the problem. But and it's, I'm not sure where it will go, but it's a lot of, Silicon Valley money business types, engineers, urban planners, a lot of folks who aren't kind of who we think about as in our inner circle, asking like, how do we help on peace, right? We're seeing all these bad things and violence and the refugee crisis, and who are really trying to look at how do you create a competitive industry that promotes peace and like peace projects and peace building, like physically building, right? We have a member at AFP who has a building in Montreal called the Peacebuilding. He's a real estate guy, and he built a kind of workspace called the Peacebuilding. Or is it that we just go back to the divestment movement, right? I mean, you're seeing finally the climate change community having some serious wins. The entire University of California school system divested from fossil fuels just about an hour ago. We saw the European Union Bank divested from fossil fuels. The African Development Bank refused to approve a coal plant in Kenya. So I think maybe it's that we reconsider in this roadmap, like, why did we drop our sort of divestment movement as peace builders? So that would be one thing, but yes, I think defense contractors make a lot of money off of this bill, and they will always do that until we create an alternative where they don't need to do that. And the second, to respond to Wardah's point, I do think this, I heard a statistic a few weeks ago from a colleague we're working with at NYU's Stern Business School, kind of on the conflict minerals supply chain space. And he said, by 2030, 2030, by the end of 2030, millennials will own over 50% of all financial assets in America. And again, Silicon Valley follows the money. Everyone's very concerned about that. So right now is a really good time for consumer-linked mass movement and mass organizing to say that, you know, millennials demand triple bottom line solutions and products and companies that support people on the planet and aren't, you know, organized around the profiteering of destruction. So I do think there's a big piece as well on the millennial and younger specific organizing.
Yeah, I mean, seeing the corporate influence on the Hill, you know, I've definitely had a different perspective since I've been on the Hill of just seeing corporate influence everywhere, and just you know, I often just assume that like people are. I just assume that people are going to be advocating on issues, and so it's really, and it's just, I mean, yeah, just getting, you know, my inbox is flooded with like corporations asking for things now. It's very weird. So I think, but it's also, you know, I think I've also seen how a lot of these, I mean, the reason why corporations matter so much for so many members of Congress, you know, corporate interest is because of constituent interest. I mean, they obviously want to care about the jobs that are provided in the district, and I think you know, the most important thing we can do for these issues that we care so passionately about, for peace and justice, is to show that you know, those are also important jobs in the district. I mean, that I mean, ideally there's like employment that you can point to at some, you know, sometimes talking about sustainable energy or things like that. But even if you don't have that, talking about how, you know, for many of you, you've made your part-time jobs doing peace work, and that's something, and you know, showing, I mean, it's always about showing the district connection or showing the state connection, and there's showing it in terms of the number of jobs and dollars is obviously the easiest and most concrete way, and so those of us advocating for issues just have a harder job, but it's still the same job. You know, you're showing how your district benefits. You're showing, you know, or you're talking about your job as a teacher or a social worker, talking to veterans who have, you know, lived the impact, you know, of a Congress that refuses to take responsibility over war and peace, and you know, so I think it's always going to be about highlighting those district jobs, so we have to think of more creative ways to do it.
All right, so I'm going to turn to the audience now. I said that I was going to give them a chance to ask each other questions, but I want to get to the audience so we have plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we're going to have, Monica is one of our microphone runners. Do you have another one?
Sergio in the back.
Sergio, okay, thank you. So let's start in the far back with on the left with the red shirt, and then I'm going to take two questions, and then over here, Sergio, after this person in the red shirt, the person in the white shirt raising a hand.
Thank you. About 2 centuries ago, Thomas Malthus pointed out that human populations tend to decrease exponentially, and we're well aware of the fact that resources on this planet are finite. Indeed, we see examples in several countries where the resources have already been exhausted and populations are still growing. So my question is, how do we avoid conflicts in the face of this continuing pressure, humans being the really only species on Earth that don't have a density-dependent control on population growth?
Thank you. Let's go ahead and take the second question, and then I'm going to leave it open to you. You don't all have to answer every question, but if one person feels strongly about taking that. So let's hear the next one.
My question is probably more directed toward Diane. First of all, your speech was absolutely remarkable. But I gave a presentation in a community this summer of peacemaking, and there were a lot of retired ministers there. And one of them brought up the idea of, he called it the ecumenical military-industrial complex. Have you thought about all of the churches and religious organizations that contribute to the military complex that we have? And the other one is the entertainment military-industrial complex. Have you thought about the influence of video games, movies, and many other forms of entertainment that permeate our culture?
Thanks. So who wants to do the first one on conflict and resources? Thanks, Madeline.
So I'm actually going to answer it in a hopeful way, which is that, I mean, yes, undoubtedly a critical problem. I'm sure you're all well aware of a lot of the studies that made arguments around linking the root causes of the Syrian civil war to natural resource degradation, as well as the uprising of Boko Haram and the devastation that has caused to Nigeria. Around, you can see these just incredibly tragic images of the receding of Lake Chad, which is a major livelihoods area, that forced downward migration, that forced a lot of conflict. However, I think even in those areas, I am very hopeful about the ability of humans to innovate their way out of climate change, out of food insecurity. I think we're seeing billions and billions of dollars going into agriculture and food security investments, and natural resource reforestation, restoration, especially in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. And I think if you work peace-building organizations that work in these places are hopeful, right? So I think what a lot of our members around the world would say was that what we need to do and what we need your help with is stopping governments from killing us, right? I mean, the state perpetration of violence and the state exploitation of resources and state oppression is usually the biggest driver of violence, and communities, and there's negative ramifications therefore. But I think peace builders themselves, and then humans themselves, I think without the context of perpetual militarism and war, I think we'll be able to innovate our way out of population growth and food security and natural resource degradation.
And let me just add to that, for others who have an interest in the relationship between conflict and climate change, there will be a workshop on Saturday for those who are not part of the general committee. There's a non-GC workshop that our wonderful lobbyist Emily will be leading. So that'll be an opportunity to explore some of those issues. On the ecumenical military-industrial complex, I completely agree. I think one of the issues we have to recognize is how thoroughly the militarist paradigm affects every aspect of our lives, our culture, our whole society, and it's really completely embedded with our daily lives. And so we're going to have to address it in all these different ways. We're definitely going to need to work with the entertainment industry to get them to develop movies and video games and music and all kinds of arts that both demonstrate the power of peace and also illustrate the dangers and the moral wrongness of war. I really am someone who believes very strongly that people have strong moral fiber in them, and that those moral leanings can make a huge difference when you think about how powerful the military-industrial complex is, and yet we're able to get think tanks to stop taking money from the Saudis and the UAE simply by making it socially unacceptable, by making them feel embarrassed. It's still in their economic interests to take that money. But they realize that they will lose their authority and their reputations by doing that. And so that gives me some hope that even though the other side has a lot of money and a lot of power, that our moral fiber and our understanding of how this hurts us will prevail.
Okay, let's get a couple more questions. Right here, Monica in the front, in the yellow, and then let's go. Are there no women who have questions? Thank you. Okay, and the blue, after Tom, the woman in the blue. Go ahead.
I'm Tom Vaughn from Silver City, New Mexico, and something that Madeline said really struck home to me, and I'm wondering if it could be expanded on by the rest of the panelists. We have 2 labs in New Mexico that amount to about $4 billion a year in annual expenditures on salaries and contractors. Udall and Heinrich are good guys, but there's no way in the world they're ever going to vote against those labs. And if you criticize them, people say, oh, we're going to get rid of the labs. We can't do that because it'd be a huge economic hit to the state of New Mexico. We had Jill Hruby, the previous president of Sandia Labs, come to Silver City and give a talk about repurposing that engineering lab. And it would blow your mind. Just as we can verify that more jobs are being found in the alternative energy source than in the traditional ones, we need to explore the positive economic incentives of converting to peace, repurposing our facilities.
Yes. I'd like to get your perspective on why the Democratic primary race with the 2 debates we've seen on television, with the exception of one comment by Senator Tulsi Gabbard saying we've got to end regime change wars, and with the exception of one question or 1 or 2 from the media after the Syria withdrawal, there has been nothing said about what they call national defense. Nothing said about seeking peace, reducing the defense budget. It's like it's a taboo subject. Do you think that we'll go right through the election and we'll never have anything said about this and there'll be no issue whatsoever? President Trump, to give him credit, talked about ending the endless wars. What are the Democrats saying? How can we get them to address these issues?
Do you want to start with Wardah? You look like you were moving things around. Either way, anyway. Yeah.
So that's where you come in on the last question. When I worked for Senator Sarbanes from Maryland, and Maryland is a state that has a lot of people who are diplomats, who work in international organizations, involved in trade, so it's a very internationalist kind of state. He went around the state, for all these interviews and debates, and not one person ever asked a foreign policy question, ever. I had prepared all the statements and all the answers to all the questions, and he never had to use them. It is up to you to ask. Now that said, FCNL is participating in a couple of efforts to try to ensure that all the presidential candidates of both parties will be asked serious questions about foreign policy. So far, they haven't all agreed to participate in these, but we're hopeful that there's one by Global Zero, and there's one called U.S. in the World that we are co-hosting, which will try to get each of the presidential candidates of both parties to have a really serious discussion of foreign policy.
Anybody else?
I'll just add to that and say I was actually just researching this today and found a really great article, I think it was from the Washington Post, of where all the candidates stand on foreign policy. And a lot of them had given non-answers on questions. The number one issue that they had asked about, and this is what you'll hear in the debates, is troop withdrawal. And that's what people see in front of them. They're like, yes, my brother, son, mother, whatever is abroad. I really want them to come home. It's like what they see. And we don't need to get to the point where we're like having, I was talking to people about this before, and they said, do we have to get to the point where we are bringing people home in body bags for them to understand, like they did in the Vietnam War, to understand the impacts of war? And so I think it's really important to hold, like Diana said, hold them accountable on that. Why do you have so many candidates? So if you look up that article, and they're asking several foreign policy questions, whether you would deal with Assad, and I remember Tulsi Gabbard was actually the only one who said she would deal diplomatically with Assad. Everybody else said no or didn't know, but there's a lot of non-answers there, and that's not okay. We need to put people on the record. We need to ask them questions. We need to hold them accountable. So it is absolutely up to you, and for those of us who do have leverage in the media, to be pushing people to ask those questions. We finally have a all-women panel at the next debate, which I'm really excited about, and that was from people saying, like, why do we not have diverse people asking these questions that reflect the America that we live in? So,
Kate.
Well, I think it's very exciting that every single candidate has said that they do support ending U.S. military involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Very big news. I guess now we have a new candidate, so for Bob Patrick, and I don't know where he stands on that, but anyway, I would imagine, well, who knows? But Nate Silver did that survey and showed that every candidate did come out on that, which is mind-blowing to me because, when we started working on Yemen at FCNL, and talking to members of Congress about it, I mean, members of Congress did not know there was a war in Yemen or that the U.S. was involved in it. I mean, it's just, and now it's suddenly something whereas it's true, on this survey as well, there's a lot of non-answers, on Afghanistan, lots of like blanks where people don't answer questions. But on Yemen, everybody answers the question. And everybody's on the right side here of ending all support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, driving the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. And so that is purely a result of grassroots advocacy. I mean, there's nothing else to thank for that. That is purely that. And talk about an example where, you look at what you're up against. I mean, on the other side, it's defense contractors and Saudi-funded lobbyists and all that, and then but it's this grassroots lobbying that really turned things around.
Great. Okay, a couple more questions. Where's my
runners? Sergio. Or Monica. Okay, let's go over here to Kevin. Yeah. Right there.
I think this is a question primarily for Wardah, which is you talked about the importance of using news media. I haven't seen news today, but yesterday Fox News was reporting on the impeachment hearings as largely proof that the deep state was always against the president. When people are only seeing news through the filters of their own beliefs, how do we break beyond that and move people beyond their comfort zone?
Okay, another question over on this side. Right here. Jim. Yeah.
Sorry. Jim Matlack. This is not a question, it's a request. Can the full text of Diana's remarkable speech be made available electronically to all attenders, please?
That's possible. All right, let's take a couple more questions, so we're still asking them. Okay, in the red right here. No. Sorry. Another red.
I'm Haley Hathaway from Santa Fe Friends and Quaker Earth Care Witness. Speaking of all-women panels, I just want to hear a little from especially the three, maybe mostly millennials, just to share a little bit about what it looks like among us to build a real intergenerational movement that centers frontline communities. What advice do you have for us, and how do we transition to this new kind of leadership? Thanks.
Great. We'll take one more question.
Ted Lapis, Wyoming. Marketing is the art of getting your unfair share. And I believe that we have failed in getting our unfair share, at least in part, because we have not named the American empire. When you name something, you have a handle. When you name something, it is no longer as dreadful as it is when you name it. And I believe that that's a failing on our part. But I also believe that we have accepted a nonsensical number, because the budget of $735 billion for the Pentagon does not include the $220 billion for the Veterans Administration. It doesn't include the liabilities that the EPA is going to clean up. It doesn't include things that are certainly the Pentagon's projects, but they get sent through the Department of Energy to develop a nuclear source for submarines and aircraft carriers. But that dedicated technology that it doesn't get used anywhere else.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, let's take those two questions, one on media and one on millennials.
All right, I can take the media one. That is a really good question. I think echo chambers are a really big problem when we think about these conflicts and what's going on. I remember seeing this stark visual when the 2014 Gaza war was happening, of how, you know, it was showing like an echo chamber that was maybe pro-Palestine and one was pro-Israel, and it was completely separate. Like there was a very little intersection between the two. So acknowledging that and recognizing that is very important. Now, what can you do about it? I gave you an example earlier about social media. Now, social media can be an echo chamber, but if you are linked to certain groups, whether they're alumni groups or people that you went to high school with or something like that, you have people lurking on your Facebook that you don't know about, and you just posting and educating people about that does things. But I think even more important is how you deal with your families. Now, we have Thanksgiving coming up, we have Christmas coming up, we have a lot of awkward conversations coming up, but that is okay. When I worked at Church World Service recently, there was a great guide that they had. It was how to talk to your family during the holidays about immigrants and refugees. And my job was to update that graphic with kind of what was going on with the Muslim travel ban and the refugee ban and dreamers and asylum seekers. It was a lot of really horrid stuff. But I was writing it in very like fluffy kind of ways to talk about that issue, because if you go into very like deep, really technical subjects, it can be very hard and difficult to get across. But if you say something for asylum seekers, for instance, these people are fleeing conflicts. Why are you putting them in detention center? Or these people, it is legal to seek asylum. Why are we violating their right to do that, right? So it's like making it very basic concepts. I don't know if they updated it for this year, but you can check their social media for that. But I think talking with family members for sure, even during the holidays when people say, we're not going to bring up religion or politics. No, you can talk about that. Just do it in a very kind, understanding way, because the people who are closest to each other are the ones that are kind of in your network of influence, and you have the most impact on influencing them versus, somebody who lives far away and just watches Fox News and doesn't have that human-to-human connection.
Just one other thing to add on the getting out of your sort of echo chamber. One new peacebuilding organization I'm really excited about is called Urban Rural Action. And it's a new American-based peacebuilding organization that is organizing communities from like urban Americans, rural Americans, Democrat, Republican, around issues. I think such a huge problem with the regression of the social fabric in America is because most of the time we're organized around party, right? Are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? We'll pipeline you. We'll throw marketing at you. Like everything, so much about our identity is around this tribalism, right? And the tribalism is what drives conflicts all over the world, and it's happening here. So I think in addition to, it's more of an offline solution, but just getting outside, getting off Twitter, getting off Facebook, and going to groups and going to and being organized like you all do around issues that are inclusive of anyone across the political spectrum, but to work together on issues, I think is so critical. And I kind of segue to the millennial-based organizing. I mean, I think in a non-disrespectful way to any other generation, I think millennials, we just have to step up and own the opportunity we have before us right now to lead, right? We have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we have the Sunrise Movement, we have so many of the biggest political disruptions that we've had in the last several years have been millennial-led social movements. And it's, you know, I think especially in foreign policy, the diversity problem is very real. It is ageist, it is male, it is white. When you come here to work, you are told to put your head down and get in line and work your way up the ladder. And the whole system of the foreign policy ladder really is focused on ageism, respect, being quiet until it's your turn. And so I think we have to just be prophetic and honest and confident in our position that it is broken, it is not working. The past paradigms of the last several decades have failed, and millennials now have to clean up these massive messes, and not in a way to, you know, to leave anyone out, right? You build inclusivity, and we need to work intergenerationally, but we also need to be confident about millennials stepping into the opportunity to lead. And I think we're seeing the success of that, and that things can still be intergenerational, but we need to just not be scared to lead, I think.
So I want to pick up on this. You wanted to talk about it earlier, and you just mentioned the diversity question. And Diana talked about, did you use the word foreign policy blob?
No.
So, I mean, there is a cohort here. There's kind of like a system of how foreign policy gets developed in Washington, D.C. that ties into think tanks, that ties into armed services committees, that, you know, it's not that big of a group, right? And who are they? So how do you break into that? And that might tie into the money thing, but it might tie into the organizing. So what's your advice about? I mean, that's kind of a Washington, D.C. issue about, but that's a group of people who are influencing how policy gets shaped.
It's a really hard question because the way people move up in the foreign policy sort of elite is to show how tough they are. And especially for women, to get yourself taken seriously, you have to be a pro-interventionist. And I don't want to be overly political, but I think, Hillary Clinton felt that herself, that she had to vote for the Iraq War to prove that she wasn't a weak, pacifist woman, and she created this persona that showed that women can be just as tough as men. So we're in this weird position where we want to be taken seriously, and we want to change the way people are thinking. And so we need to create new institutions that aren't getting their money from the Saudis and from Raytheon. There are some new foreign policy think tanks that are out there. There's one called the Quincy Institute that is trying to bring the left and the right together. So it's funded by George Soros and the Koch brothers. And they don't agree on everything, obviously, but they agree that the United States should not be in all these wars around the world, and that's not the way to go about, U.S. foreign policy. They agree on restraint. Now, well, I won't get into all the details of it, but so there are these options out there, and there are progressive think tanks, but raising the money for these, to hire people to do it is just very difficult. So if you can get all your money from huge corporations, it's a lot easier to hire high-profile thinkers.
And I will say we have seen some movement in the last year, where I think one of our funders is Plowshares that has granted FCNL money for a long time, and I wrote a year ago, basically their president said, I'm not going to participate in any panels that don't include women, for example. So that was only a year ago, but that recognition is important. So do you want to add, Wardah?
Yeah. I can add that as somebody coming in, one of the reasons why I wanted to go into foreign policy is because I saw that lack of diversity, and I saw people making policies like the Iraq War and the invasion in Afghanistan about people that looked like me or prayed the same way as me, but they didn't have any of the same values. They didn't share any of the same background that I did. They did not understand what it was that we believed. They had painted this kind of Orientalist, Islamophobic lens. And so when I was talking earlier about the military article, I think that Islamophobia is one of the ideologies that increases our militarism, especially in the Middle East. And that's why it's so important to point out, people who are serving. But I think, for me personally, coming in, and Diane, you mentioned networks of women. I think that's really important. One that I did was Foreign Policy Interrupted, and their mission is to get more women mic'd and bylined. And it's run by these awesome women who were correspondents in the field, and now they're back teaching people how to, their trainings are incredible because they show things where men will go on the news and say absolutely ridiculous things and nobody questions them on it, like nobody. But if a woman said it, everybody would, we've seen how Hillary has been treated. So I think it's really important to get into those institutions. Another one is women, WCAPS, which is Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. That was started by Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. She's a woman of color who was serving in the State Department, and building that community and interest in people of color. I think some people, for me, growing up in Texas, I didn't know this was a career that I could pursue. That's why it took me a little while to get here. So it also comes in talking in schools and meeting with young people and high school students and middle school students and teaching them that this is a possibility. And yes, you can interject yourself into the foreign policy community. It does not always need to look white, male, old, and no offense to any of the people in this room. But it is great to have people. It is great to have people that actually reflect the countries, and that should be what is amazing about America, right? Like, we all come from different backgrounds, a lot of us. So why, this is something our ambassadors recognize, is why aren't people making our policies also reflective of that? So I think looking at supporting institutions, for instance, the fellowship that I'm doing right now is to get more Asian Americans on Capitol Hill, APEX, so that's one that I recommend. And for think tanks, the Center for Global Policy is one that's a newish think tank that focuses more on like the Islamic world, and they have a lot of, I think, like actually Muslim experts that are working there, so that's pretty cool.
Great.
Yeah, just super quickly, when I worked for Congressman Honda, our kind of predecessor, which we joke about, you lost. When he was one of the first Japanese American members of Congress, and whenever we had these like Friday afternoon musings, and all these like ambitious public policy wongs would be working for him, he would just say, at the end of the day, when I think of the longevity of my life, I think one of the most important things is just changing who's at the table, right? Because as long as the same people are at the table making the decisions, it's never really going to change until the composition changes. And so I just think, as every one of us in this room who cares about peacebuilding, who cares about war, just think about what you personally can do to expand the pipeline, right? Like, in every meeting, if you're in a meeting and there's all white people there, like, think about fixing that so that next time there isn't. Or if you're in a meeting and it's all male, think about fixing that next time, and think about how you hire, how you spend your resources. Just always think about the pipeline of diversity, and eventually the picture will change. And then just one other thought, one of my favorite books that I read on this recently, which is ironically by a white male professor from Harvard, but Stephen Waltz, who I love, he wrote a book called The Hell of Good Intentions, and it basically, I read it when I left DC. I was so frustrated. I was like, I have to get out of there before I lose my vision. And it was all about, it was saying, the reason foreign policy is fail, his whole thesis of this book is foreign policy is failing because it's so undiverse. That like it's the sector that has been the least innovative in the last 4 decades. And until innovation and new ideas and new thinking and new people are shaping foreign policy, we're just going to continue to fail. So if you're passionate about this and thinking about it, it's a good affirming read that you're right.
What's it again?
It's called The Hell of Good Intentions by Stephen Waltz.
just wanted to add, I also didn't realize until I transitioned to the Hill that how few foreign policy jobs there are in the Hill. I mean, so I would just add to this conversation that you actually have an opportunity with so many Hill offices, I'm particularly talking about on the House side, to help shape what foreign policy means to them. I mean, because, I just really, as one of the few people who really get to work on foreign policy on the House side, it's amazing to see. I mean, of course I knew that, staffers are handling lots of different issues, but particularly when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, that is so often just an afterthought. I mean, that is one of 14 issues someone's handling, and that's like the 14th at least, most important issue, right? So that many of you in this room are far more steeped in foreign policy than many of the House staffers that are assigned to handle foreign policy for their members, and that's not, any kind of criticism for that's the way that things work, and that's unfortunately how much foreign policy is often devalued. There are exceptions to that. Obviously my office and many others, but that is often the case. And so, and as someone who's lived and breathed foreign policy for so long, then coming into that and just seeing how, all of us talk, I mean, we all know, I think, Diana's talking about this kind of world of like foreign policy and what we, and there's the Armed Services Committee and for most of the Hill, I mean, the armed service, there were 600 some amendments on the NDA this year in the House, and precious few were actually about foreign policy. They're mostly about military bases inside the United States. So it's just, I think it's both frustrating, of course, to see that, and it's also a reminder of how we have a huge opportunity there. And advocates on foreign policy issues have a huge opportunity to get to open staffers' eyes to a new way of engaging with the world.
Okay. Sergio, right here. Yes. And then we're going to have one more in the back.
Hello.
Stand up.
Yeah, I'm Kaime Terry
Okay,
from Minnesota.
Go ahead.
I'm Kaime Terry from Minnesota. And I just have two comments. Number one, Diane, you answered my dream for why I came here. And number two is your talk must appear at TED Talks. How many have heard of TED Talks? It gotta be uploaded into YouTube. I promise it will become viral. I really believe it will. It should appear at TED Talk. And it does not cost anything.
Thank you. Okay, in the back, yes. Yeah. Hold on.
My name is Grace Green. I'm from Seattle, Washington. And my question is more so on how we can start with millennials or Gen Z to know what they're getting themselves into before they enlist into the military, because I feel a lot of times, like in high school in JROTC, they're just training them the discipline and the work ethic, which is great, and we love that. And also as our Black community here in America, I feel like we don't focus enough on that, because the first thing to structure them and get them out is to enlist into the military. And also I am from the school of thought of we do have and this is a question for anyone on the panel to answer, because I respect the Nation of Islam, which is the Black Islam here in the US, and I feel as though people who Muhammad Ali, who stand against militarization and enlisting into the military for things that we don't agree with and things that we don't have here at home, and then going to other countries to affect them. I feel like we need to inform people better so that they know and can be educated more. How do we as lobbyists or as people in our communities educate others on the cost of wars?
That's great. All right, so one more question. Yep, over here. In the back. Yeah.
My name is J.B. Riffle, and I'm a member of Mohawk Valley,
Stand up.
Mohawk Valley meeting. I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has considered rejecting capitalism as a means to peace.
All right, who wants to start this time? Two diverse questions and encouragement for a TED Talk.
Can I just take the one about getting young people to understand what they're getting into before they join ROTC or the military? And let me just say, can you think of what a great place it would be if instead of, or at least in addition to a reserve officer training corps, we had a reserve diplomat training corps. What if we were investing the same amount in the Peace Corps? Okay? So that there was a path out of poverty and a path to employment and an economic incentive for people to become peace workers. That's what we need.
I love that. I will just add that while I was at FCNL, one of my favorite graphics that they made was literally a dollar sign that showed how much of your tax dollar went to war. So even if you're not joining the military, you are contributing to war, my friends. Fun, fuzzy feeling. But it's really, really important to just like visualize that. And I think with young people, especially, graphics really resonate with them. I mean, people of all ages do. But when you want to literally see how much war costs, look at that graphic. I don't know if you've been updating it every year, but I think that's an amazing way to just simply understand that.
So one of the things, to the question earlier about how do we build an intergenerational movement, I think the second is that, as you just talked about, is an intersectional movement. Which again, I think we have in the 1960s, and it was about the intersection of racism and Vietnam and systemic oppression, and I think we're hitting a point in society again where we're seeing these intersection of chronic evils. And so I think one thing that is really important, it's been really hard to do in like the foreign, here in Washington, it's like people who are on domestic issues are here and people who are on foreign policy issues are here. But I think millennials and younger, we don't see that. Like I think, I care about violence because my best friend was murdered and because of the genocide in Rwanda, right? Like it's like I learned those things at the same time. So violence, I think, to me and to our generation and below is very intersectional. And I think that's where there's newness for the movement, right? So the March for Our Lives peace plan isn't actually that different than like what peacebuilders in Mali are advocating for, right? It's actually really similar. And one thing that we're doing in Plus Peace is, we're trying to help connect that. So we're working with March for Our Lives and now connecting them to a youth peacebuilding movement that's working on a UN resolution who often aren't connected, but I think we have the opportunity to talk about, and FCNL, you've always done this, you have always been the leaders of these prophetic interconnections, but I think as a broader community, we haven't organized around the intersection of violence. So I think there's that great opportunity. And then just the question on the school to prison pipeline, I think, Diana, that bill would be brilliant. But I also think, Barbara Lee and the progressives have, for years, had a sort of school to prison pipeline legislation that I'm sure FCNL chapters could pick up. And it's important to remind folks that that those recruitment patterns are still happening and they're still targeting underprivileged communities.
So Kate, the question about capitalism, rejecting capitalism. That's a big question, and I think that I would just remark that I think there are traces of, I don't think Diana's speech is rejecting capitalism, but I think there are traces of thoughts about how well capitalism is working or not working, and I think those are the questions to start parsing the threads of the economic systems that we are using and what could work better. But we might have to leave that question to another evening. So I want to wrap up now because I know that I'm seeing some people kind of wandering out. It's approaching, as we say in Quaker, midnight. So I will invite you to join me in thanking Diana Ohlbaum,